Hello, good afternoon and welcome to Full Scottish here at Broadcasting Scotland with me, Donald C. Stewart, in a packed programme today. We're hoping that we're going to have a couple of regular guests with me in order to discuss a smorgasbord of topics as usual, including the BBC, refugees, the budget that's due to come down in Westminster, and of course up here the SNP leadership. And who I do know I have with us is the former BBC Current Affairs journalist and in part of the very positive campaign Keep Scotland the Brand, Ruth Watson. Ruth, delighted to have you with us and welcome to the programme.
That's great. Thank you very much for having me on.
And we have snow in the streets, but also leaves in our lines as we're trying to get in connection with Hugh Watson from down in Wales. And once we've got a hold of him, then we'll be saying, Hugh Marshall. Once we get a hold of him, we'll be saying welcome to him. But before we get there, we begin, as we always do, with the Ukrainian update on day 382 of the war in Europe. Now, every single time I come in here to do this, this is one of the things that is a constant. And I suppose that it's always important that we take an opportunity now and again to simply pause and reflect on the fact that these are words, but somewhere in the world they are realities for real people and real human beings. So as it is shocking to hear it, it must be doubly, in fact, a heck of a lot worse to live it. So from today, we hear that Bakhmut has become a killing zone. It is probably highly challenging for Russia's Wagner mercenary forces trying to continue their assault westward. And this is according to the UK Ministry of Defence. In the Ukraine, a Ukrainian military spokesman said on Saturday that more than 500 Russian troops were killed or wounded in a recent 24-hour period in Bakhmut. Serhiy Cherevati said the Russians had launched 16 attacks in that time, with 23 clashes taking place in Bakhmut itself. Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Russian paramilitary group Wagner, said on Saturday that his forces were close to the administrative centre of Bakhmut. 3 civilians were killed in Russian shelling of Kherson, meanwhile, in the south of Ukraine on Saturday. Another died in Donetsk, according to regional officials. Russia has bombarded Ukraine with more than 40,000 times since its invasion in February 2022. This according to the Ukrainian Interior Minister Ihor Klimenko. The shelling had destroyed more than 150,000 residential buildings since the war began, according to Euromaidan. Russian missile strikes targeted critical infrastructure in Zaporizhzhia, with strikes likely to have come from S-300 air defence missiles. Canada has announced a ban of imports of Russian aluminium and steel products with the aim of denying Moscow revenues to fund the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has urged Germany to speed up supplies of ammunition and to start training Ukrainian pilots in Western fighter jets. Ukrainian officials have said most of Kyiv's power supply has been restored following a Russian missile and drone barrage targeting critical infrastructure, which happened on Thursday. And Iran has reached a deal to buy advanced Su-35 fighter planes from Russia, Iranian state media said on Saturday, expanding a relationship that has seen Iranian-built drones used in Russia's war on Ukraine. The United Kingdom government has written to Olympic sponsors urging them to pressure the IOC, that is the International Olympic Committee, over its proposal to allow Russians and Belarusians to compete at next year's Paris Games. And in news that will probably worry pandas the world over, Russia has listed the World Wildlife Fund as a foreign agent. Ruth, if I could turn to you first of all, I think one of the things, as I started saying, is that the war in Ukraine, it's very easy to become fatigued by it and perhaps flippant when you're reading out statistics and things happening that are not on the other side of the world, but they're not necessarily down the road from where we live. And it is important, I think, to keep our head in the game and remember that this is a very real threat to not just the Ukrainians, but also in many ways world peace.
I mean, it does concern me when you look at what's happening with some of the global strategizing, that perhaps the BRIC nations have thought that now is their time to sort of shift the world order. I don't think that the world order as is ideal in any way, and perhaps does need shifted, but not in the direction that it's going. I don't think we should ever forget that the Leave campaign to start kicking off the Brexit campaign, which has destabilised not only destabilised the UK's whole political framework, but was intended perhaps to start a domino effect across Europe. That was kicked off in the Russian embassy, and I think that we need to remember that Russia has. With Putin, I mean, Putin's never lost his KGB concept of this brilliant big empire as was, and keeps talking at length about bringing the empire back to what it was in its sort of glory days of the 1800s. It's very odd the way that these sort of these rulers often have a way of sort of harking back to some halcyon era. But we can't lose sight of the fact, yes, this war is happening hundreds and hundreds of miles away. But if we don't support the Ukrainians, not only because it's the right thing to do, because they have been invaded by an aggressor in an illegal war, but they are what is keeping us from having Russia actually expanding across Europe. So Poland is extremely concerned about what's happening. Finland is extremely concerned about the potential, the saber rattling that has been going on. We mustn't forget that Russia for years patrolled tanks on Poland's borders, and just last week was warning Georgia, telling them, well, look at what happened with Ukraine in 2014 if you don't control your population protesting against Russian influence. So yes, the war in Russia, the Russian war in Ukraine can seem very far away. But if we don't support the Ukrainians, we run the risk ourselves of the war happening on our own doorsteps, and the fate that is happening to these terribly brave people could well be happening to us and our neighbours. So we have to support Ukraine, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it is the first line of defence for our own homes and our own well-being.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ruth. And the eagle-eyed, of course, amongst you will have noticed that we've had our own little domino effect, and I am joined by Hugh Marshall, journalist and broadcaster, New Media Wales. No doubt having had a particularly good day as Wrexham sit top of the National League, and Wales even won a game of rugby yesterday. Hugh, delighted to have you. And of course, as we've always been doing, you're a regular on the programme. Ukraine is much in our minds. And I finished this morning by talking about two things that I think are important. And it's a sporting theme, I suppose, and other organisations, first of all being the International Olympic Committee, looking at perhaps allowing Russian and Belarusian athletes to participate in the next Olympic Games, and the World Wildlife Fund being identified by the Russians as a foreign agent. There are certain bizarre implications of the Ukrainian conflict, but in a sporting sense, I suppose, there's a real worry that normal relations will be brought back and people will think we're back at where we were before the war began.
Yeah, and I think, it is this, it's a strange situation. I think, those of us who remember conflicts like the Balkans and the Falklands, you wouldn't have found at those times people still sort of trading and dealing with them. So the fact that, things like the grain exports, that negotiations with the Russians continue to allow things like that to happen, whilst there's an ongoing war, you would think that there would be, a complete block on, Russia and Belarus, and that would include, unfortunately, the sports. I know that it's difficult for sports people because obviously they're not part of the war, they didn't start it, but you have to draw a line somewhere. So it is something that's difficult, that's challenging, but there is this risk of just normalising Russia and Belarus within that global context.
Indeed, and you would have to be, and sport takes us into our next topic, obviously, because you'd have to have been on the moon to have missed the furore over the last few days regarding Gary Lineker, Twitter, match of the day and BBC sports journalism as Lineker's tweet, which likened the wording being used by the British government as being similar or reminiscent of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, has led to a huge fallout, with sports journalists on one side refusing to take part in BBC programmes, and the BBC on the other side attempting, in their own words, to implement their guidelines for their the people who present on their programmes. And therefore, if I can turn to you, Ruth, first, fairly obviously, as having worked within the institution yourself, the BBC, for some would claim, are in a difficult position because they have to be seen to be impartial. But that impartiality does seem to only push in one direction. Would that be accurate?
It does nowadays, but back in the days when I worked for the BBC, it was something I was very proud of. And now, when I tell people I work for the BBC, I tend to say back in the days when it was something to, back in the days it was good. I mean, I was horrified when I came back. I went and lived overseas for a while, so we were just getting the World Service, which actually is still the bastion of good standards. And when I came back to the country in 2015, I was really shocked because people who had helped train me in broadcasting standards and journalistic standards back in the 1980s and 90s were still working, and yet the editorial guidelines seem to have, or the editorial practice seemed to have changed. And I'd be watching programs going, well, that's the clip, that's the edit. You know, I'm watching, for example, the Hollywood Parliament, and knowing what, as a presenter and as a producer, I would have expected to see coming out on a news program, and then seeing something completely different. And that really shocked me. And it's one of the reasons I became very involved with Broadcasting Scotland, for example, because I think that it's really important that there is some balance. Now, I do think Broadcasting Scotland perhaps could have more balance in it, but given we are where we are, I think that it's very important that there's an alternative view that is people are able to hear, because I don't get that in the BBC. And in terms of the impartiality, I completely agree. Back in the good old days, when I used to work for the BBC, you did not know what somebody's political leanings were. You should never have been able to tell what somebody's political leanings were by the output that they put out. You should never, no program should have had, the point was, we all took pride in giving as journalists, we all took pride in giving politicians equally hard kickings. So there was genuine parity, and you didn't get a liar or an idiot on telling you that the moon was blue, and then sort of get a professional on, to say, so tell me, is the moon really blue? And so the truth was the truth. The truth is immutable. Facts are facts. They don't flex according. Perspective may be different, but the facts are the facts, and the truth is the truth. And that's, as journalists, we're meant to be truth seekers and present that, and then get other people on to provide context. And that's where the balance comes in. So for me, the BBC is completely out of order, but how could it not be? Look, there's 4 senior Tories involved in the BBC. The Director General, Tim Davie, I wrote it down to get it right. He stood as a Tory candidate for Hammersmith. He was a deputy chairman for Hammersmith and Fulham in the 1990s. This is a man who has a complete agenda to shift things to the right. They didn't have a problem when Jimmy Savile, the beast, Jimmy Savile wore a t-shirt saying vote Conservative. They didn't have a problem with Andrew Neil, political editor of the news, the Spectator. I may have got that wrong, but I think it's the Spectator, coming on and spouting his beliefs. They don't have a problem with Sir Alan Sugar, who has his own programs spouting out against strikes and other political activities. But they do have a problem with a footballer who is not a political commentator, but is a football commentator, unlike Andrew Neil, for example. They have a problem with him basically mirroring back what a Holocaust survivor told the Conservatives just a few weeks ago, that the language is reminiscent of Germany in the 1930s. Gary Lineker is absolutely correct. He has spoken truth to power. Outside the BBC, there's an Orwellian quote, George Orwell being basically saying, "It's our job to tell the truth. If you don't like it, suck it up." I paraphrase. He said it more eloquently. But basically, the, the, how the BBC can turn around and say, it's, we don't live in a fascist state, and then clamp down on freedom of speech from somebody who's only vaguely within the sort of commentating sphere, it's absolutely appalling, and it really worries me, because one of the reasons I became a journalist was because I think that it is critical to democracy that we are given full access to the facts, and then as individuals are able to make our own minds up. And what we are getting now is basically the worst of bilge water pumped across our airwaves, and for it to be the sporting greats who are holding us, who are basically giving us the alternate view, the honest view, it says a lot about the cowardice in broadcasting at the moment.
Indeed, and we go from a Scottish commentator into a Welsh one, and of course, Hugh, I would hardly imagine that BBC Wales would give airtime to a Conservative Party politician on a morning programme discussing anything, given the lack of representation the Conservative Party have in Wales as a country. But there again, am I fabricating it, or is it just fabricant that they troll out in order to discuss issues?
Yeah, like you say, as you reference there, this morning, there's a lack of discussion around politics, in the media in Wales. So, Radio Wales have an hour-long programme on a Sunday morning between 8 and 9, and they were discussing, the small boats and Rishi Sunak's discussions with France, and who they got on to discuss it was Michael Fabricant. Wales has got, I think it's 13 MPs, and, they've got a number of Senedd members. But again, it's that go-to somebody who's got a profile and, and is seen as being, extreme, as if, that is part of their reasoning for balance. But, I go back, I was, I worked for S4C, the public service broadcaster. I was head of digital for 4 years, between 2012 and 2016, and obviously that was at the time when social media was becoming more clear, and we had to come up with guidelines for presenters and and staff and such like. But I think some of us of a certain age, if you remember back, my childhood in the 70s, Guinness Book of Records with the McWhirter brothers. You think of things like Patrick Moore, who presented one of the longest series of Sky at Night on BBC. The McWhirter brothers and Patrick Moore were, they were extreme right in their political views, and they were involved in setting up right-wing organisations. So, there is a history of this, of people, fronting programmes, being involved in programmes that do have, that have had political views. But this week they've just, they're just digging a bigger hole for themselves, because the disappointing thing is, obviously, as the discourse goes on, they talk about Gary Lineker saying, that Gary Lineker has compared, the small boats with the Nazis. It's the language is important. He didn't say that. He compared the language as similar to that used in Germany in the 1930s. And there's a big difference there, I think, when people are, you bringing in things like the Holocaust, to try and bring comparisons, when, he didn't say that. What he said was factually correct. There's a number of examples being shown this week of the language used in 1930s Germany, not just by, the Hitler and the Social Democratic Party, or the whatever party the Nazis were, in other spheres. And it is this, this creeping use of language that is where problems arise. And, respect to Lineker and to all the other people who've come out to, in solidarity. But I would like to see, BBC staff, because obviously, the production staff, because, it's time that they made a stand as well. It's, anyway, that's, I just think, it's difficult, but I would like to see, this being called out more by people within the BBC as well.
Indeed.
I think
And
that some of the stuff did come out yesterday and refused to. I think it's one of the reasons one of the programs didn't come out in the way it was supposed to, was because the staff said that they weren't going to participate in it. I think that one of the things that underlines it, and that worries me very, very greatly. I remember back in the 1990s when people talked about the BBC being disbanded, and we laughed. Oh, how we laughed, and said, well, it could never happen because people love the BBC. In the same way with the NHS, we go, oh, it could never happen because people love the NHS. So I think that the Conservative Party has had a long agenda, and it was with the BBC. It started with Rupert Murdoch, the strategy. I think that there is an agenda to, you can't disband something that people love, so then you have to stop people from loving it. It's very Orwellian. You take away the love, you take away the respect, and then you can take it away. Because then when the BBC is finally disbanded, and we will regret a lot of things when it is gone. When the BBC is finally disbanded, we will go, well, good riddance to bad rubbish, because look how awful it was. But it has been a death by a thousand cuts, and they're going to come and do the same to the NHS. And I think that one of the things we need to be very, very careful about is the principle of public broadcasting. It may be that Channel 4, for example, as a public broadcaster, is a model that more people can sit with. It may be that in the day of digital televisions and people subscribing to things, that having to pay a license fee for something like the BBC needs to be looked at again. But having a reputable and honourable, honest public broadcaster is very important, because there's an awful lot of people that can't afford public streaming services who need to have access to genuine, honest, reputable television and radio programs. And in terms of the World Service, I understand that the World Service has a sort of slightly dodgy and sketchy past, because it was kind of like the propaganda wing of the British Empire as it was in its death throes. But when you talk about countries that are going through revolution, when you talk about countries that are oppressed, being able to access the BBC through the old shortwave, that was a way that a lot of people in Burma, Myanmar, were able to get access to the news. When you're living under a repressive regime, you need to have access to the news. And I think that it is very dangerous that the BBC got rid of the Arab world broadcasting. That we need to have genuine, impartial broadcasting. And I think that if the
absolutely.
BBC goes, we will find ourselves in something more of a pickle than we had anticipated.
Absolutely, and of course, the public sector broadcaster and the language that is used by some in order to describe events has been very much in the news this week, because the BBC get embroiled in the whole thing to do with refugees, and then the UK government came out with a three-word strategy: stop the boats, which is very reminiscent of COVID. And this morning, Suella Braverman was on Nick Robinson's programme and being broadcast by the BBC. And this, of course, is a Home Secretary whose husband is Jewish, who, according to her this morning, their family very keenly feel the Holocaust, and also her family fled from Africa in order to seek refuge in the UK, coming off boats in order to ensure safety and security for themselves. And Hugh, if I can just turn to you, the refugees, we are a paltry contributor to safety and security in comparison to many of our European colleagues. And yet this seems to be a consistent, and you referenced the McWhirter brothers, of course. They were behind the Freedom Association in the 80s and 90s, a very well-known right-wing think tank, along with a variety of others long before we heard about Grafton Street and the IEA and the Adam Smith Institute, who were very prominent in talking about having secure borders, yet another phrase that is used now and again. But it would be hard to believe that the Kindertransport of the 30s would get through anything that this particular government are putting up in order to stop refugees coming into this country.
Yeah, but I think the wider context here is, I think it's clear, and this is why it's sort of exploded in the way that it has, is that we're basically seeing the death throes of the Conservative Party. They know that they're facing sort of a wipeout of the next general election. Their only hope now and their strategy is all based around stop small boats. So, you've had Sunak, you've had the Conservatives essentially doing it. In Wales, Andrew R.T. Davis, the leader of the Conservatives, he tweets about small boats on a regular basis. So they're basically targeting this hardcore demographic of, I don't know, 1 in 3, whatever, who, small boats, immigration, pushes their buttons, and they're basically banking everything on that in order to ensure that they don't get completely wiped out. And I think that's why there's been such a backlash, is when somebody like Lineker points out how awful their policy is and the language they're using, that's why the Conservatives say, well, this is part of our big plan. How dare he come out, and how dare he, sort of risk our sort of political strategy in the last 18 months that they're going to be governing. And Suella Braverman, I just don't understand it. I don't understand somebody with her family connections and her background, sort of saying that she's dreams of waking up with a flight full of people going to Rwanda. It's bizarre, and I just can't make sense of it.
I think that's one of the issues. I think that, Ruth, it's hard to get your head around. Those who have contributed by being benefited by refugee status and indeed been taken in by this island are now responsible for not allowing that benefit to be given to others. It seems very strange.
I don't know, a pop psychologist might say it's a pretty classic case of self-loathing being iterated through forcing it onto other people. It may well be that when they came to this country, they so much wanted to become a part of it that, and faced with what would have been pretty appalling racism back in those days, they perhaps just had to abandon and hate everything that they were to try and assimilate into a pretty toxic and racist political framework. It worries me because, again, this is language which is reminiscent of Germany in the 1930s, and in fact, Great Britain in the 1930s. The UK was a pretty nasty place. You've got there's that infamous photograph of the young Queen Elizabeth with the Queen Mother and her Princess Margaret, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, as they were doing the Nazi salute, because Nazism. It was fascism was something that people were quite attracted to in England. Mostly there's the Daily Mail, the Daily Heil, as it still is, and it ran this huge campaign against bringing in Jews. The Jewish people who died and suffered on various refugee boats that were shipped from pillar to post until they were either torpedoed or ended up in horrible locations with catastrophic results for those people. It is infamous, and the St. Louis, yes, and then the reason it was the kinder transport, those poor children arrived with their parents being slaughtered and coming off cattle trucks to be slaughtered in horrible ways. The reason the families weren't coming was because racist Britain didn't want them. The huge, you don't have to go back too far to start looking at. There's a pretty long seam of racism and intolerance on these shores. And mercifully, most people now, I think, are pretty decent human beings and aren't racist and aren't bigoted. And the UK government, the Westminster government, has lost support so far that it relies on othering. So that's what Brexit was about. Brexit was about othering. Brexit was about the social contract in England is so broken that you can't get to see a doctor, you can't get to see a house, you can't buy a house. The chances of getting into a decent school are limited. All of these things are problems that have been pushed on by a Westminster government that has cruel policies that favour a very few very wealthy people. The Scottish government, conversely, has got the best functioning NHS in the country. It has got the social contract, so you get prescriptions, you get into school, you get to see your GP. If I've got a problem, I can see my GP the same day. No problem, no questions asked. I mean, it is really amazing. So there's a lot of political analysts that think that the reason why Scotland voted Remain and England voted Leave is because the Scottish social contract is intact. So the othering that was trying, the West with the Leave campaigns, it's all those people, them over there, it's their fault, everything's miserable and rotten because of immigrants. Scots didn't believe it because our lived experience wasn't like that. Many people in England believed it because life was so rubbish. There's a kind of there's two theories. One of which is that people thought life is so rubbish, let's kick the establishment. The establishment wants us to vote Remain, so we'll kick the establishment in the nuts and we'll vote Leave. Another aspect is that you just had the racists who went, yeah, it's okay, it's other people's fault. So now the other is gone because Brexit has happened. The disaster that is Brexit has happened. So the new other is these people who are getting into boats to come to this country. But the problem is, when you say let's stop the small boats, I want to see the small boats stopped. But the difference is, I want to see the small boats stopped because we have got a functioning refugee system which allows people to come in humane and safe ways. Whereas the Conservative parties, when they say stop the small boats, they mean let's just seal the border up and then we'll just live in this hermetically suffocating island where we need to find somebody else to blame our problems on. So what the real problem is, that a lot of people don't realize that there are no safe routes, that there's no way there's no way to claim asylum in the United Kingdom unless you're in the United Kingdom, because the system is so messed up. So the only way people can claim asylum is by coming to these shores. And that's what Rishi Sunak is saying, was that even if you come to these shores and to claim asylum, you can't. So it's a totally, it's like if Kafka met Catch 22, it's a horrible situation. And it's cruel and it's wicked and it's criminal. And I think that Gary Lineker, all power to him and all respect to him, he has housed Syrian refugees. He's part of a refugee housing program. He has met Alfie Dubs. He actually knows what he is talking about. And I think that we turn our heads away from this at our peril, because we are in 1930s Germany. We are repeating those same mistakes. We are listening to the jackboots on the street, but it's somehow like we can't quite hear the echoes yet. So we need to stand up for this. This is an issue that must be fought and must be won for common decency. And where in all of this is Keir Starmer? Keir Starmer makes Lily Liver look dark and attractive. I mean, my God, the man just has absolutely... The Labour Party has shifted so far to the right in an attempt to mop up the sort of the sloppy seconds of the Tories. I don't even know what they stand for anymore. It's disgusting.
Well, it's
Sorry, I'll stop.
interesting, I suppose, Hugh, that we know in Scotland that we are putting our hand on our heart and we're saying that, let's be honest, in truth, as Ruth was alluding to earlier on, that we do have pockets of people who have racist overtones and do have anti-refugee sentiment. So that we are honest enough to put our hand on our heart and say that, they are there, but that we do universally, I think, recognise and believe that we should have increased numbers of refugees in here, because we need a wider pool of talent when it comes to our economy. What's it like in Wales? And I'm particularly interested, as Ruth just alluded to there, in terms of Keir Starmer, in terms of the Labour Party, there has been a massive collapse of the Labour Party in Scotland over the last decade or so. And of course, Starmer is making a huge amount of play, as indeed is Anna Sarwar, the Scottish leader up here for the Labour Party, that they need Scottish seats to be returned at Westminster. Is there a sense in Wales that the refugee problem is one that politicians with a London focus are dealing with, but the population are far more liberal than they would suggest they are?
I think it's really interesting, sort of declaration. I'm a member of Plaid Cymru, and I've been a Westminster candidate for Plaid Cymru. So my politics from that perspective are quite clear. Welsh Labour had their conference in Llandudno over the weekend. I think it's still going on today. So Keir Starmer was there yesterday, and Mark Drakeford made a very powerful and emotional speech, because I don't know if you're aware, unfortunately, Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales, lost his wife, sadly, recently. So, you could see, he was full of emotion, and towards the end, he did, the emotion got to him. But his view is completely different to that of UK Labour. As you say, Starmer is trying to appease that, the red wall, this, it's almost like, focus groups are told them that if we want to win Darlington or whatever, we've got to, be tough on small boats. Drakeford yesterday was complete opposite, saying, Wales is a nation of sanctuary, that that is an important part of what Wales is, but also it's an important part of what the Labour movement is and was. So there is this big difference between Wales and Scotland. Wales sadly voted for Brexit. It was a small margin, 80,000 majority, which is about the population of a town, a city, or it's a city now, Wrexham. So it wasn't a huge number. But what was interesting was a lot of people have tried to apportion blame on Brexit on the number of English people who've moved into Wales. So there was 20% of people in Wales were born in England, therefore they are the ones who voted Brexit. When you look at the South Wales Valleys, which has got the highest percentage of people who identify as being Welsh, they voted for Brexit, in a substantial majority, and those are people who vote Labour and have voted Labour for the last years. Different to Scotland, Wales has never voted for a majority of the Conservatives at any election. So there's this weird sort of duality going on, whereas in Wales, Welsh Labour, it's almost like a completely different party to UK Labour. They're members of Parliament. You've got people like Stephen Kinnock and Chris Bryant, who are very, UK. They're wedded to the Westminster way of politics. And then you've got the Senedd members who are far more progressive and far more left wing. Drakeford was a supporter of Corbyn. So there is this difference, but I think it comes down to, unfortunately, it's about education, political education, the media. We were discussing this earlier, the fact, where do people get their news from? The Daily Mail is still the most popular newspaper in Wales. Thankfully, newspaper circulations are falling, but who's filling in the gap now? GB News, Talk Radio. Okay, they're not huge audiences, but they are, they're generating that audience. And it was interesting to see that Jeremy Hunt, and the HM Treasury were tweeting about an interview Hunt was doing with GB News. They didn't mention the fact that he was doing live interviews with, BBC and Channel 4 and stuff. But they were, promoting the fact that he was doing something on GB News. And, it's clear now, it's just part of their strategy is to, like I say, is stop small boats. They've workshopped it, and they've found, that this is our best thing, is just, we'll go after that hardcore of people who, during Brexit were told that, as you said previously, all their woes are because of immigrants. They can't get a place in a school. They can't get an appointment with a doctor because immigrants, are taking up those things, which just isn't true. I don't know if you remember, it's still up there on YouTube, the video that, Leave, played about, they were showing, an elderly woman with a daughter trying to get an appointment to the GP, but it was full of people. And we all know, we got Farage in front of his poster, saying, we can't take any more. This fact that, people think that, the UK is filling up with immigrants. It's not, there's a shortage of people, to work, and of that age. We've got an aging population in the UK. We need new blood because we just haven't got enough here ourselves. So it's this clash between the reality of what's needed, and immigration is part of that. But the rhetoric is because they know that they can get votes by being a little bit racist.
Indeed,
I think that the other thing, I think the other thing that we need to remember also in the middle of all this, I completely agree with what you've just said. I think the thing we also need to remember is that the reason that people will get into small boats and risk their lives to cross the water is because that fear of getting into that small boat and crossing that icy cold water is nothing compared to what those people have already lived through, what they've already experienced. And for us sitting here in our, even in the very worst of circumstances that we live in this country, even those of us who are really suffering because we're cold and we can't afford to eat, that life is still safer and better than the lives that people have seen coming over here. People do not leave their country to make the journeys they are making unless they are fleeing something truly awful. They know that Britain is a great big steaming turd at the moment in the political and economic world. They know that. They know that. But they still are coming because it is better than the misery and the fear and the danger and the suffering they are leaving behind.
Indeed, and if I can take the metaphor of choppy seas, and indeed the idea that what we are facing is within the United Kingdom, a struggle. This week, we are going to see Jeremy Hunt deliver a budget. And according to the Chancellor's press office, there are things that we should expect and things that are going to, as he went round this weekend, a number of news outlets to emphasise that the economy is what it's obviously going to be about, but how he puts it back where he believes it ought to be. And Ruth, if I can come to you first, we all kind of know what it is that we're likely to get, but what should it be that we should hope for, given that there are falling gas prices and therefore there could be a bonus there for people? And there are also higher tax revenues than were expected, giving this particular Chancellor some headroom in order to deal with the economy as it stands and the cost of living crisis that people are facing.
Well, what we should be expecting is for gas and fuel prices, for energy prices to be coming down, for support to be given to the farming community so that they can produce the food that we need to feed ourselves. Although the prospect of getting people to actually pick the produce is limited because of Brexit. What we should be expecting is that the NHS will get its budget massively increased. And of course, Scotland needs that too because of the Barnett formula. Every time that part of the NHS in England, because England is used as the standard, the yardstick, every time one of those services is put out to private tender, then that does not that revenue is not included in the Barnett formula. So Scotland, with our NHS, which is still pretty much in public hands and as one big NHS, our revenues get cut. So we need for the English standard to be raised for the NHS for them to get more funding, and England needs to do that anyway so that they can actually see people getting the treatment that they need. So what we should be seeing is more social housing in England. What we should be seeing is better schools, and what we should be seeing is for councils in England to be getting the money that they need to be able to look after their populations. All of that's not going to happen because they have this obsession with just giving us the crumbs off billionaires' tables. So what we should be seeing is HS2 scrapped and turned into a great big cycleway, and perhaps try and make up for some of those trees that have been cut down for some mad glory project that Scotland and Wales are paying for, but we're going to get no benefit from. And we should be seeing expansion of a green agenda, but not the crazy rewilding that's going on, because rewilding, regenerative farming and regenerative approaches to our hills and our wildlife is absolutely the way to go. The obsession that Zach Goldsmith has and his ilk with rewilding is just going to see actually, it's just going to be another kind of playground for the rich and wealthy, with people being kicked off it. So we're going to get less access in England and less food in England, which is going to have a knock-on effect in Scotland. So I would like to see, having been at I was at the SNP conference last year, and I listened to all of the ministers saying basically the effects and the impact of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's fortnight of madness that had thrown a bomb underneath the economy in Scotland and our budgets. And people were genuinely concerned about the cuts that were going to have to happen because the money was just gone. It just disappeared. But there's no reason for that money to have disappeared. So I would like to see Jeremy Hunt actually looking at plugging some of the holes that the Tories have been, however many trillions of debt that we're now in after all these years of Tory governance. I don't know what it is the Conservatives are meant to be conserving. It just seems to be their own personal wealth, because they're not conserving anything that's good for the rest of us. So I live in hope, but I suspect that actually I just am going to be profoundly disappointed by the venality again.
Indeed, profound disappointment may well be what we feel as the week goes on. But Hugh, if I could just refer to this is from HM Treasury Press Office that plans expected to remove barriers to people getting into work as part of this particular budget and tackle Britain's economic inactivity problem. Support, I use the word advisedly, will focus on disabled people and those with long-term health conditions, over 50s and low earners and parents in universal credit. So basically, our economy is going to be built back up on the backs of the infirm, the elderly, the skint, and those who have other responsibilities, most of which they get hammered for if they ever find themselves ending up on the front page of Wales's most popular newspaper, the Daily Mail. It's hardly a good plan. Sorry, Hugh.
Yeah, I think the problem as well is obviously in Wales, it's Barnett consequentials. As you said, it's what England spends on the NHS, then that means that Wales gets to spend that money. The NHS in Wales is the worst performing of all the NHSs in the UK by a long stretch, and that's under a Labour government. It's not the Labour government's fault, in its entirety. There are issues, with some of the health boards, but it comes down to the money that's made available. If they need to make money available for, for people who do have long-term health issues and things like that. Wales has a higher level of people with long-term health issues. We've got an older population. We've got people, we've got high levels of poverty. Poverty in Wales, child poverty in Wales is higher than anywhere else in the UK. But, because it isn't the same in England, then obviously those consequentials aren't enough to answer the issues that face us in Wales. And as I said, I don't expect anything from this budget. It'll just be, saying, oh, look, you can trust us now, Kwasi Kwarteng's gone, the madness has stopped, we're the sensible ones, we know what to do with the money. There'll be something in there, I'm sure, to try and bolster, pensioners because they vote Conservative. But I'm not. But this is the whole issue of why the Westminster model is broken. It was interesting. Will Hayward, a journalist with Wales Online, he interviewed Starmer yesterday in Llandudno, and he asked him directly because of Barnett consequentials. Rail isn't devolved in Wales, unlike Scotland. So Wales doesn't get any of the consequentials from HS2. So Wales is missing out on £5 billion. So Will asked Starmer, well, do you make the promise that, a Labour government will, honour those consequentials? And Starmer, wouldn't commit himself. He wouldn't say yes or no. But, it's just a matter of fairness. And the fact that, it's not fair at the moment because the Conservatives, even the Conservatives in Wales say that that it's unfair. But my worry is it doesn't matter what Hunt says. What Rachel Reeves is saying is almost exactly the same as what Hunt's saying. So we're just going to have the same. If Labour take the next government, more of the same, and that's the worry. There's no radical thinking about how now that we grow an economy in a responsible and sustainable way, because it doesn't unfortunately it just doesn't making companies wealthier and making shareholders wealthier. We've seen how the top 5% of the world, whatever, have become richer, whilst the other 80% have become poorer. That there's a structural unbalance from an economic point of view, and current economics just doesn't address that.
Indeed, and a final topic for today. Of course, we're not going to get through this weekend without having to refer to the SNP leadership election. And Hugh, I'm going to come to you first because I'm fascinated to see how it's looked upon from outside, because, of course, there has been a radical alternative to the Labour Party, to the Conservative Party in Scotland. And during many elections, I know that many in England have talked about how they would like to have been able to vote for Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP because they could see them as an electable alternative to what they're being offered by other mainstream parties. And even when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader, there was certainly not a belief, it would appear, within the Labour Party, especially not in the north of England, that he was an electable prospect. But the leadership election within Scotland has got a little bit more personal this week. And the legacy of somebody like Nicola Sturgeon is perhaps for some up for debate now as to whether it will be something that will endure or it's about to fall apart because one or other or either or any of the three possible candidates may abandon a lot of the very policies that she was front and centre of. So from an outsider's perspective, I suppose, as Burns may well have said at some point, I'm asking the others to tell us how we look.
Unfortunately, it's just something that crops up on the news occasionally. I'd imagine if you asked people on the street in Wales who the three candidates were, the vast majority wouldn't have a clue. And I bet you most of them wouldn't even know that there's a leadership campaign going on now. I think, looking at it from an odds point of view, I think, Humza has a higher profile because obviously, because of the position he's held from a health perspective. And I think, he's got a higher profile than both Forbes and, forgive me, again, just showing Ash Regan. So I was surprised actually at the lack of depth of people who were standing for it. I think obviously one of the issues was because of the nature of you need the leader of the SNP to be in the Scottish Parliament. It did, it meant that the Westminster lot, weren't viable considerations. But I think sadly, from an outsider perspective, it's just one of those things that will happen and people won't really register what's going on. But I think what's interesting, looking at the opinion polls that came out last week, showing that independence was at 52%, but the SNP's lead over Labour, even though the SNP is still, I think they're down something like 5 points on what they had at the last general election. The gap with Labour is closed because Labour obviously picked up votes from Conservatives and other, they're picking up unionist votes, I would imagine. But yeah, no, it's I think people need to sort of separate the fact that Scottish independence isn't the same as who leads the SNP. I think obviously any party that loses a leader the calibre of Nicola Sturgeon, she's probably, for my reckoning, the best politician the UK has seen in the last 20, 30 years. And losing somebody of that ability and that ability to connect with people is going to be a huge loss to the SNP, and it is going to be a challenge to them. But I think, but it also gives them an opportunity to refocus, and try and draw a line behind, under things that maybe, weren't populist with the population. But, it'll be interesting to see how it pans out. But interesting, there was an opinion poll recently that showed that support for independence in Wales had dropped dramatically in the last sort of few months. So again, it all depends on the wind of change in Westminster. I think in Wales, what we tend to get is, people are fed up with the Conservatives, Labour is the alternative. So, it's polarised from that perspective.
Indeed, and Ruth, I suppose from inside of Scotland, it got a little bit personal this week. It was interesting. I might be wrong, but I think that Ruth Forbes was the only one candidate who, when asked if they would employ the other two in the cabinet, had said yes, but seems to think that Humza has been a complete train wreck, if I can use that analogy, over all of his positions within government. I can't remember who it was that got the trains to run in time the last time politically, but Kate Forbes seems to have positioned herself to likely to appeal to those with a slightly more conservative social viewpoint. Ash Regan seems to think that a wider independence movement perhaps The endorsement coming from a former leader is significant and key, and Humza Yousaf seems to be the legacy candidate. And I know that there have been suggestions that John Swinney's endorsement of him could be a panic within the party hierarchy, which is very difficult to knit together given the relationship the two have had for a long time. So is the SNP about to eat itself, or is it really going to find a platform to zoom ahead and find our independence for us?
I think that when the leadership changes, and there's always going to be reverberations. I think that Kate Forbes perhaps kind of got a wee bit carried away and lost herself and forgot that she wasn't in a debating society, but actually working with colleagues there. And I was quite surprised, I was quite shocked at the kicks that she took. I mean, from an out looking at it from the opposition's point of view, gosh, no wonder Douglas Ross was smiling at First Minister's questions. So I thought Nicola's comeback was really funny, but I think that while I could admire Kate Forbes's lines from a completely, from a debating point of view, wow, that was a really good whammy because it was a clever line. I don't think it was necessarily accurate, but it was a clever line. However, I think it might have damaged her in some ways because she came across as being somebody who was more about her ambitions than perhaps was either fair or was really sort of playing for the same team. It just seemed a bit odd. It was an odd line to go for. I think she got a wee bit carried away. I mean, I have to say, I like Humza Yousaf very much. I thought when the campaign started up, I really hoped to see more people. I think that Kate Forbes is an excellent finance minister. I think she did an extremely good job under very difficult circumstances, stepping in from Derek Mackay. She hit the ground running. I mean, Humza's like a Clydesdale horse. And you kind of know that he's going to get the job done. He's a worker, he's a grafter. And Kate Forbes strikes me like being like the kind of like if you keep the equine analogy, she's kind of like zippy, and she's like one of these little sort of ponies that you're going to get a really good run across a nice West Highland beach, and she's fiery and she's zesty and she's actually quite excited. So I was actually really excited when she entered the race because I thought, oh, this is great, get somebody who's a bit of younger, a bit zesty. And then I heard the words coming out of her mouth. Now, I absolutely respect 100% her honesty and her integrity. But I think that Humza had a line that he said at one of the hustings, which was, we don't just want to tolerate diversity, we want to celebrate diversity. And for me, I think that's a really big line. I would like to see an independent Scotland in the fullness of time as a republic. President Andy Murray, it's a good one. But I think that we need to have a separation of religion and state. I think that France has got that right. So I would be very concerned to have any politician who couldn't honestly and immediately tell me that it's not just that they will uphold the laws that are already in place, but they will actively seek to promote laws that enshrine equalities. And Ash Regan, I mean, I just think she doesn't have. I just feel that there's a puppeteer behind her. I like what she says about independence. I like what she says about let's get to move on. I'm very, very dismayed at the kicking of the can down the road potential that I hear coming out of some of the other candidates' voices. So I can see why Ash Regan appeals to people like me who want to see independence happening this year or next year, because quite frankly, people are suffering too much under the current Tory framework. Under the Westminster framework, Labour's the difference between Labour and the Tories is like asking me to choose between jelly and blancmange, quite frankly. I just want a nice cheesecake. But between the three candidates, I think that when I look at them, I can see perhaps what the political parties in an independent Scotland might look like. I can see that actually the SNP is such a broad framework. It's such a broad church, to use the phrase advisedly, that I think that in an independent Scotland, we will see the SNP break into different smaller parties. And I think that Ash Regan, Humza Yousaf and Kate Forbes perhaps represent three wings of what the SNP could break into as new parties in an independent Scotland. And I think there's a place for those. I just think that currently we have to enshrine people's rights. And I would have liked to see just to put it out there, I would have liked to see Jenny Gilruth stand. You know, if that would have made life a whole lot easier. If she'd agreed to stand, then I think that we would have be having a different conversation right now.
Indeed. And we've run out of time. That is all for this week's Full Scottish. First of all, can I thank my two guests? First of all, Hugh, from all the way down in Wales. It was delightful to have you with us and get you on. I know that technical difficulties from our end were the issue there, but fantastic.
It was my end,
once again. Was it? Oh, well, there we go.
I had a crash my end, unfortunately.
Delighted that you got through the crash, obviously not an HS2 crash, and obviously as well, Ruth, great as always to see you, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you for having me.
So, on a weekend where Kafka met Catch-22, with an Orwellian quote thrown in, we discovered that in that type of context that Douglas Ross can indeed smile. As it is the end of this week's Full Scottish, before I go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to every single one of you who has donated, and to every single one of you who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Right now, we have a pressing need to raise £30,000 to pay our bills and ensure that we're able to continue making these programmes and more, because we have the capability to do so if we have more volunteers and we have the funds to make them. But from me, Donald C. Stewart, here in the studio, it's goodbye and thank you for watching as I go to see if I can find the right cheesecake instead of the jelly and blancmange that I won't be having for my tea.